Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today's video we're going to be doing a fantasy football preview of the Atlanta Falcons for the 2021 NFL season. As promised, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be going through my fantasy football projections at each of the positions for all 32 teams throughout the next couple weeks. So if you're interested in stuff like this, please check out my channel. I also do a lot of other stuff on my channel. I make song covers, I react to songs, I also talk about the NBA, stuff like that. So if you're interested in a wide variety of stuff, please like, comment, subscribe, and let me know what you think. But let's go into the Atlanta Falcons, because there's a lot of stuff I want to talk about with this team that kind of gets to some of the principles of being successful at fantasy football that I talked about in my last video. In case you need to rewatch that, it's called 7 Strategies to Winning Your League in Fantasy Football. If you check it out from my videos posted a couple days ago, you'll see it. Yeah, that'll give you a good basis to work with. So let's talk about the Atlanta Falcons. So Atlanta's got a lot of uncertainty to their roster, but I think it's important to talk about it. Namely, Julio Jones is a big uncertainty. Earlier in the week, he announced that he wanted to be traded. He didn't make a formal request to the team from what I'm tracking. He just did this through Skip and Shannon's Undisputed. So, yeah. But anyway, it's still interesting, though, because this really plays a lot into how you're going to look at this team moving forward. So let's first start by taking a look at their schedule for next year. I think it's important to look at the schedule for these teams because that gives you an idea of when these players are going to potentially boom or bust as the season goes along. In the case of the Falcons, so they started off the season with Philadelphia. Good first game for their offense. Then they play a tough defense. They play Tampa Bay. Then they go to New York, the Giants, that is. That should be a better scenario for their offense to succeed. Then they play the Washington Football Team, a team that's projected to have a very good defense. Then they go to the New York the New York Jets. And they play them at home. So, and then they have a bye week. And honestly, this continues a lot through their schedule. They have a good matchup for their offense, and then a bad matchup in that they're playing a good defense. So, for example, they've got the Jaguars, week 12, projects to be a terrible defense, but then the next week they've got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So, what this means is that with this lineup, you can expect some uncertainty. There's not necessarily a stretch of good games going forward, but that gives you a good predictability with this roster in that you're not necessarily going to get a huge stretch of games that's going to skew your numbers. So when they play a tougher stretch of defense, it might give you some room for them to fall apart. So I think that's important as well in terms of when you're looking at the projection of this team on offense. So now let's go through the positions for these teams. So first we're going to start with Matt Ryan, their quarterback. So, depending on what happens with Julio, this is definitely going to impact Matt Ryan's numbers. And even if Matt Ryan is even on the team, we'll have to see how that goes. But, sorry, I'm trying to figure out these lights here. But anyway, so it's important to keep in mind, though, with Matt Ryan. So, he was the number 12 fantasy football quarterback last year in terms of his numbers. However, he was the number 4 quarterback in terms of his pass yards. So, and this hits at something that I try to target with quarterbacks is that I generally try to avoid quarterbacks like Matt Ryan because Matt Ryan is a guy who's going to give you passing yards, but he's not necessarily going to give you any rush yards to give you a good floor basis. So why is this important? You want to have quarterbacks are going to have up and down games depending on the defense. If you have a quarterback that is running the ball like Lamar Jackson, Deshaun Watson, Kyler Murray, you name it, Tua, guys like that are going to be running the ball a lot, you're going to have a floor that you can work with for those quarterbacks. So let's say that they rush for an average of 50 yards a game, you're always going to have at least 5 points to build off of. So if they have a good game or a bad game, if they rush for 80 yards, they even get a touchdown, even if they have a game where they throw 2 or 3 interceptions, the fact that they're running the ball and they're effective on the ground, it gives you a good floor to work with so that you have less room for error. For guys like Matt Ryan, if they have a bad game, they're not going to make that up with any rushing yards whatsoever. So it's really dependent on the matchups with guys like Matt Ryan. And I think especially now that he's kind of trending into more of that range of a guy that is performing somewhere around the 12th best quarterback at the fringe of who would be ranking within your 12. Let's say you're in a 12-team league. He's kind of toward the end of a guy that's either going to be starting or a guy that's going to be on the bench or not on a roster. He's a guy that I'm looking at as more of a stream quarterback. He's not necessarily a guy I would draft particularly high because, as I'm going to talk about in a later video, quarterbacks have a very consistent play and streaming value that you can always pick up guys based on matchups that could fill some needs you have for a particular week if somebody's on a bye or whatnot. So it's probably, in my opinion, not best to draft Matt Ryan particularly high. If he falls to you, great, but I'm not really necessarily putting up all stops to go get him on my team. Running backs. Another big point I want to talk about. So Atlanta, notably over the offseason, they cut Todd Gurley. A lot of people I've talked to don't necessarily know that. But what's important about this is that as of right now, their running backs are 2 guys they picked up from free agency. They picked up Mike Davis from the Carolina Panthers, and they picked up Cordarrelle Patterson from the Bears. These are interesting pickups to me because this is a team that doesn't really have an established running back outside of when Todd Gurley was there. The other guys they tried to utilize in position, like Quadree, Ollison, Brian Hill, they didn't necessarily take advantage of the opportunity. So they're relying on Davis, who did well with the Panthers, but you break down Mike Davis's numbers. Yes, he was the number 12 running back in PPR, number 18 in standard, but a lot of this was because of the Panthers system revolves around passing the ball to running backs. There were several games in which he had multiple targets. Pulled up right here, actually. So for Mike Davis, when he was with the Panthers, he had games where he had 6 targets multiple weeks. He had a 10-target game. He had a 9-target game, an 8-target game. So he built a lot of his numbers because of the passes that he was getting in the backfield to a guy from like Teddy Bridgewater, who's not necessarily going to throw the ball down the field. That wasn't really the Panthers' system. They were relying more on short passes, quick plays. Atlanta is the opposite. Atlanta is a team that likes to gun it down the field. The guys like Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, Hayden Hurst, guys I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So for me, I'm very cautious about Mike Davis. I would not recommend picking him up in a draft because I think not only that is he going to have to adjust his new system, but he's 28 years old. Same with Cordarrelle Patterson. He's a guy that fits into a gadget system who's a good sweep option type player or a passing down running back who could be effective at times. But to me, the biggest takeaway from this team is that there is a void to fill in this running back tandem. And this is a topic I'm going to talk about a lot, but when you have a void, you're looking at a roster of guys or a pool of guys who may not have necessarily stood out in how they played. They're veterans that are kind of on the tail end, i.e. Mike Davis and Cordarrelle Patterson. They're filling the starting position. They don't really have a lot of success in their future. So the likely projection is that a young guy who's coming up into the league is probably going to be a person that I look to fill this void and eventually be the long-term running back for this team. A good example of this was Jacksonville last year. So Jacksonville, they cut Leonard Fournette. They had some issues with Rykel Armstead and COVID. So because of that, they were down to literally guys that they can just use to fill the roster from the practice squad. And one of them was undrafted James Robinson. He ended up being a top 10 running back in fantasy football. He was top 5 up until he was injured, and his season was cut short. But this is an excellent situation of in Atlanta of something that I could see similar to that. You've got some guys on the roster like Tony Brooks-James, a young player who's going into his second year. Javian Hawkins and Caleb Hunter are two other players that I look at as well as potential guys that you could pick up for them. But it's going to be interesting to me because I would not be surprised if one of these three fills the running back position and ends up being the starter, but I also would not be surprised either if there's the future stud fantasy running back isn't even on this team right now. So keep that in mind. I'm skeptical of Mike Davis and Cordarrelle Patterson. I would recommend avoiding them. Julio Jones. This is the big topic that people are talking about with the Atlanta Falcons is where is he going to go? So first of all, if he stays on the Falcons, which at this point I think is unlikely, this guy is going to be a top receiver. He's probably going to be a first or second round pick. But I think of note, Julio was hurt a lot last year. So Julio really did not perform up to the draft expectations that I think a lot of people set out for him. That being said, if there's some other receivers out there like Devontae Adams, DeAndre Hopkins, even Tyreek Hill, even though I don't necessarily go in that direction of him usually, it might be worth looking at some other receivers if you're in a first-round draft position, but definitely second round if he's available. But likely he might not be on Atlanta. But if Julio is not on Atlanta, then I really like Calvin Ridley's prospects going forward. So again, you look at the voids of when somebody's leaving a team, who's going to fill it. So in the case of the running backs, they just need somebody to fill the position because they don't have a lot of guys to work with. But for a case of Atlanta, they're going to be losing an all-pro receiver, Julio Jones. Somebody is going to step up and fill that void, and Calvin Ridley is the exact candidate to do that. Do not let people fool you into thinking that Kyle Pitts is going to take these targets over Calvin Ridley. It's going to be Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley, you look at his numbers from last year, he was the number 4 fantasy wide receiver in standard points per game and the number 5 in PPR. And this was primarily as the number 2 receiver for a lot of the season. Julio did not play for a good majority of the season, so that's part of why Calvin picked up a lot of his numbers. But you just look at the increase from his totals. So the first 2 years, he averaged about 63, 64 receptions and about 800-something yards. But last year, he went all the way up to 90 receptions, 1,300 yards, and a 15.3 average with 9 touchdowns. So this is a guy that is going to have an opportunity to have more playing time and more receptions. He's already got that last year, and he's going to get even more if Julio is gone. And a lot of people are not talking about Calvin Ridley. They're talking about Kyle Pitts because he's the guy that's got drafted. But this creates a prime opportunity to take advantage of a guy who's going to have a low draft stock. My guess is Calvin Ridley is probably going to be somewhere between a 3rd to 5th round pick. He could give you first round wide receiver production. So this is an exact candidate that you want to look out for if Julio Jones gets traded for a guy that you want on your roster. It's going to be interesting to see where the draft boards will have him go in fantasy football, but I'm just telling you that now because I think a lot of people are going to be sleeping on this guy. Another guy that people are going to be sleeping on is Russell Gage. Russell Gage had a very good season last year as well. A lot of this was because Julio Jones was hurt. But if Julio leaves, he's just going to have more opportunity. Russell Gage came on strong towards the end of the year last year as number 2 wide receiver when Julio was out. And I think that trend is going to continue as the season goes on. Into next season as well if Julio is gone. So keep an eye on Russell Gage as well. And that's going to be another guy, too, that he's not going to go within the top half of a draft round. So if you could catch him in a late round, he could actually be very good value for you. But again, this is another position, the third receiver. Maybe it's one of these rookies. Atlanta did pick up a lot of rookies on their roster for next year. Some notable ones are Christian Blake he's not a rookie, but he's a young guy they could be looking at. Frank Darby is a rookie they got from Arizona State. They just picked up, I believe that's somebody from Notre Dame. I can't exactly remember, but they've got a couple rookies like Juwan Green is a rookie, Antonio Nunn is a rookie. They've got a lot of young guys that could potentially fill in. and fill that third receiver spot. So I don't know who exactly it's going to be right now, but it's worth keeping an eye on as we go into the preseason and watching their practice reports. Tight end. So to Kyle Pitts now. Kyle Pitts is going to be in a situation where what I like to talk about as being overhyped. So hype drives draft pick value, and what ends up happening is that guys that are basically in fantasy football, people are taking the names more than they are so taking the stats. For people that are casual fans that don't really pay attention to stats, or as closely as they say to do, that is. So Kyle Pitts, because he's the highest drafted tight end in the history of the NFL, he's got a lot of hype around him. So he's going to probably ascend up the draft boards. I think he could be a very good rookie for this season, but the general trend with rookie tight ends is that they have a difficult time adjusting to the league when they first come in. Good example of that is T.J. Hawkinson, who had a very poor rookie year 2 years ago. He was also a top tight end draft pick who was, I believe, drafted 7th or 8th overall that year. And I'm worried about Kyle Pitts because let's say for some reason Julio doesn't get traded. Matt Ryan is going to have Calvin Ridley, Julio Jones, Russell Gage, Hayden Hurst, who was a good tight end for them last year. I think Pitts is going to get a good amount of Hurst snaps just because of how he was drafted, how high he was drafted. But there's a lot of concerning factors here with Kyle Pitts. And I think especially if people are going to be hyping this guy to be at the level of prime Gronk, Travis Kelce, George Kittle, if he for some reason goes up into the top 6-7 rounds, I would personally not do that. I would rather wait until a later round of the draft to get a guy with more floor or stream tight ends that could give you some value. Because ultimately, if you're drafting a guy like Kyle Pitts that high, you're taking away one of those running back and wide receiver depth that I talked about in my first video. That will be really beneficial for you. And again, Hayden Hurst is a guy who had a good season last year with Atlanta. I don't know if he's going to have that opportunity with Kyle Pitts there now to put up the stats that he did, but he's a guy that maybe he could be a good floor player to keep an eye on because he's got talent and he's had a pretty productive NFL career so far. I'm going to briefly touch on Atlanta's defense, and all I'm going to say is avoid them. They were one of the worst fantasy defenses last year, and they're going to have guys like Tom Brady. Panthers are better with their offense. Saints will have a good offense as long as they have Kamara and Michael Thomas. So in general, avoid the Atlanta defense at all costs. Do not draft them. Another point I want to make in the last few minutes I have in this video. So Younghoe Koo, the kicker for Atlanta, had a very good season last year. He was a guy that was wild, for the most part, was widely undrafted. And he was picked up on waivers and he became, give or take, the number 1 or 2 kicker throughout the rest of the season. And he missed some games as well. So if he was fully healthy the whole season, then he would have just ran away with the number 1 position among kickers. So this just proves to me, and hopefully to you as well, is what I'm trying to convey, that you should not be drafting a kicker anywhere higher than the last round. Maybe the second to last round if you're in a pinch and you have a lot of defenses that went off the board and you're trying to pick between good kickers and bad defenses. Maybe it's worth taking kickers in the second to last round. But kickers are guys you can get off waivers and you can stream in so many ways that could be beneficial to you. Koo was a guy who you got off waivers and he ended up being a huge asset for you. And I think the formula for success, which is true again for Atlanta this year, which is why I'm a fan of picking up Koo if he's available in that last round of the draft, is Atlanta doesn't have a great running back system. They've struggled in the red zone, which is again goes with not having a great goal line running back. And I don't really see this changing based on the current lineup that they have, especially if Julio Jones leaves as their red zone target that they've always employed in the past. So Koo could have another great season, but personally, there's going to be other teams like this that you don't know that will have good kickers that break out that were undrafted. So do not draft a guy like Harrison Butker, Justin Tucker, something like that, with 5 rounds left in the draft, because that's just simply a mismanagement of the rest of the talent that you have of running backs and wide receivers available at your dispense that you could use to fill out the roster in ways that could be more beneficial to your positions. So yeah, that's all I got on the Atlanta Falcons for this video. A long video, but it covers a lot of points that I'm going to continue to talk about in these videos for ways to be successful in fantasy football. Once again, if you're interested in videos like these, please like, comment, or subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.